Okay, let's get started. Welcome to our program today, One Solution for Climate Change. Can carbon pricing make a difference? I am Laurel Plimier. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and I'm personally very excited to be bringing you this program today. The current state of our climate is really troubling to me, as I'm sure it is to many of you, and I'm always happy to learn about potential solutions, and I hope that you are as well. So thank you for choosing to spend some time with us here on Zoom and on YouTube. To learn about this important topic. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. So if you are on the Zoom call with us, please remain muted for the duration of the event to minimize background noise and to prevent your photo from your video from popping up on our live stream. If you want to see the panelist who's speaking at the moment, you can select speaker view up in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. You can post your questions about carbon pricing for the panel now or anytime during the presentation, either in the Zoom chat or in the comments on the YouTube live stream. And I will ask as many of them as I can during the second half hour of our program today. If you are joining us on YouTube, please subscribe and click the little notification bell and you'll get notifications of our future live stream events. And for advance notice of future events, you can join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, www.lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also become a member of the League there, and your dues alone help support the grassroots efforts of the League, both locally and at the state and national levels. The League's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work now and for the foreseeable future. So we have an exciting program today. We have 4 panelists with us, but before I introduce those carbon pricing experts in more detail, I wanted to kick things off this afternoon with the introduction of a special guest, Piedmont Mayor Teddy King. Mayor King has over a decade of service to the city of Piedmont, and she also has extensive government and public policy experience, both in DC and in San Francisco. Her areas of expertise include energy, transportation and infrastructure, housing, and environmental sustainability. And she's going to share a few words with us about why she finds carbon pricing compelling. And I hope
there we go.
There you are. Okay.
Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. I'd like to say first and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I am now I'm at a hotel room in Sacramento because this is the week of the League of California Cities annual conference, and among the many issues that I'll have the opportunity to learn more about are ways that fellow California cities are making their municipalities greener and more environmentally responsible. So that is always high on my agenda. Before we kick off, I feel like in some respects I've had the honor of being attached to these policy issues for a long time. My first job out of college was working for a member of Congress where the senator from Tennessee gave a speech at just down in the Cannon Caucus room on all the junior staff people's lunch hours. And of course, that was Al Gore when he came out with his first book. And he really, as a 21-year-old with my colleagues, he really lit a fire amongst many of us. And I think when I look around the folks on this call, probably really our generation, we're the first generation that's really understood what are the implications of all of this CO2 belching into our atmosphere day after day after day after day for now since the Industrial Revolution, going on 200 years. And as you may know, I served on City of Piedmont's first environmental task force, where we created our climate action goals. And that was I started that in 2011. And since serving on that task force, I've continued my volunteer work. Now, as mayor of Piedmont, I am helping to move our city forward in honing as closely as we can to policies that are going to make us a model of sustainability. And I will be honest, it's challenging, because it's really, I think a lot of Piedmonters care about the issue of environmental sustainability. And certainly it's no longer like climate change is a dreadful concern down the line. We're living with this every year. And for years we've been saying, oh, our children are going to see the effects of climate change. We're feeling the effects of climate change. And the requirements for all of us, the moral imperative for all of us to step up and take action are greater now than ever. I'll go out on a limb, and I'll say that, like many of us on this call, I'm very happy that we have an administration finally who is taking climate action seriously and is moving forward on federal policies that are going to help the United States get to where it needs to go. In the city of Piedmont, I could say that as I think probably everyone on this call knows, we have a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2005 emissions by 2030. We are on track. I mean, we have periodic updates from the city manager and from our sustainability coordinator. It's tough though. I mean, it's all in, and we have to take advantage of every proposed policy to meet that goal. And then on top of that, we have an 80% greenhouse gas emission. We want to get that 80% below 2005 by 2050. So that really, it's 2021. That's around the corner, and we have to continue leaning into that. In the past year, we've moved forward with REACH goals, which are going to require that all city residential buildings come into better environmental standards every time they sell. Every time you want to renovate, every time you're going to put in $20,000 worth of improvements, it's going to trigger a host of environmental initiatives in your own home that will help us get to that goal. We have a policy where we intend to be a zero carbon municipal government by 2050. And so that means all of our city buildings and our landscaping, our vehicles, et cetera, will have to arrive at a carbon neutral spot. As we all know, I keep saying that, perhaps you don't know, the city of Piedmont made the default procurement for electricity from PG&E the highest, most sustainable cocktail of electrical power coming into Piedmont homes. So basically, if you are a homeowner or even a renter and you have solar power on your roof and you augment that with your regular PG&E power, you're double maxing on your renewable energy, because you're both creating it at home and you're paying for the most expensive mix that is 100% renewable and throws funds into the system to help bring new cleaner electrical generation online. And we made that decision as a council because we knew that our constituents, one, are asking for it, and two, we're more likely to be able to bear that responsibility of putting more funds into the system to create a market for cleaner, greener electricity. And so we feel that's not only a environmental justice issue, but that's an equity issue because all Californians should be able to have access to clean and renewable electrical generation, irrespective of income. So that is a snapshot into what we're doing at the city of Piedmont. We have really tried to move forward in this area to the best of our ability. This year, we finally have hired, she's been in her job for over a year. We have a sustainability coordinator. That was a proposal that we made when I was the chair of the environmental task force back in 2012 when we issued our report. And Alyssa Dykman is terrific, and she is helping us steer the course for all the decisions that we make so that every item that comes over to city council and it is reviewed by staff is viewed through the lens of sustainability. So I'm going to just take on really what one of the major issues that we're currently working on, and one that I'm spending a lot of my time on each and every week, and that is the issue of the Piedmont pool. Alyssa Dykman is a valued source of insight as we go about the process of the next round is we're going to select an architectural and design firm for the Piedmont pool and the surrounding aquatics area. And we want to bring that to the highest standards that we can to create a pool for this century that will meet our environmental goals. But we also have to make it doable. So that's a tough one because I didn't even know this before this whole issue came up, but pools have huge carbon footprints. And I guess it's not surprising because there's so much water that you have to heat to make it usable. So we're throwing everything we can at that between solar panels and hopefully some electrical generation and making sure that we have the best and most technologically advanced heating mechanisms that we can, and pumps. Of course, pumping is a huge issue for pools too. So I have to say this issue is near and dear to my heart. And I do want to assure everyone that your city government in Piedmont is working very hard to try to move us in the right direction and to be the decent stewards. I don't want to even say good stewards because it shouldn't be like, you shouldn't get extra points in my mind to have a city government that cares about the future of the planet. This is an existential question that we're facing. So City of Piedmont's being responsible and will continue to be responsible. And I have to say that it is with the nudging and prodding and advocacy and lobbying and, buttonholing of, what's that term, buttonholing when you're at Mulberry's or at the dog park, from all the folks in the League of Women Voters plus Piedmont Connect that is helping move these policies forward. So with that, I will turn the time over to the real experts on this issue. But most importantly, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to participate. And I look forward to learning a lot in this session.
Thank you so much, Mayor King, and for giving us a little insight into what the city is doing around climate activism. I really appreciate that. We have 4 panelists with us today who will be teaching us a little bit about carbon pricing. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of who they are now, and then I'll give you some additional details before each of them speaks. So joining our panel are Anne Infeld of Citizens Climate Education, and she'll be teaching us the basics of carbon fee and dividend. Dr. Daniel McFadden, who is a Nobel laureate economist and a UC Berkeley Professor Emeritus, will discuss the economics of carbon pricing. Danny Richter, who is the VP of Government Affairs for Citizen Climate Lobby, will give us an update from Capitol Hill. And then finally, Mike Mielke of Silicon Valley Leadership Group will discuss a little bit about the business case for carbon fee and dividend. So we're gonna get started with our first panelist, Anne Infeld. Anne is a retired IT solutions architect and a volunteer with Citizens Climate Education. She was attracted to joining the Silicon Valley chapter because of its values, its people, and most importantly, its solution architecture. Anne is going to be introducing us to carbon fee and dividend.
All right. Thank you, Laurel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have some expert speakers who are coming up who are going to talk about some of the details around carbon pricing. I'm going to start by just giving you the basics. I'm going to talk about what is carbon pricing, talk about how it works, the impact it might have on ordinary people, and then what is carbon fee and dividend. But I'm going to take a little detour first and give you my story of how I come to be here as a climate advocate talking to you. And my story begins with me learning about increasing carbon in the atmosphere and becoming concerned with what's going to happen to our planet. And then more recently, that concern's been amplified by actual events. We're having more fires, more floods, more hurricanes, more days over 100 degrees, and even a hard freeze in Texas. This particular photo, which seems to be an ever more familiar scene in California, is showing a backburn at Shaver Lake during the Creek Fire in 2020. So all this information coming in, frankly, it was depressing and it was frightening. It made me feel like humanity is facing a huge problem, an insurmountable problem. And given what I've learned about human nature over the course of my life, it seemed like a pretty tall order to quickly clean up our act. So I just thought, gosh, we're going to have to let this happen. It's the fate of our species. So one day I was talking to my son and I expressed this to him, what I just said to you, that climate change is a big problem and there's nothing we can do. And he looked at me and he said, "That's fine for you, Mom, but what about me?" And that just stopped me in my tracks. I started thinking in more concrete terms what it would really be like for my son and my potential grandchildren to be struggling to cope with an overheated planet in the years to come. It made me realize that I at least wanted to try to help. I suddenly felt like I'd been planning to go down with the ship and I hadn't even looked for the lifeboats. So I went to work on my own carbon footprint and I made some progress. But at the same time, I knew that just my action wasn't enough to have much of an impact on the bigger picture. Experts say we need to get to net zero carbon emissions no later than 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But to do that, we need to do things no individual can tackle alone. We need to build out our electricity infrastructure to handle much greater loads. We need to develop carbon-free fuel that can power planes or trucks or ships. And that level of change can't be accomplished by an individual. It requires resources and coordinated effort and legislation at the national level. So my next step was to join an organization that's working for national action on climate. And that's where I found some good news for a change. There's a whole world of organizations who are already working to drive carbon emissions to zero. I decided to join Citizens Climate Lobby, and that's where I learned about carbon pricing. So let's start thinking about carbon pricing. This pie chart shows greenhouse gas emissions in the US by sector in 2019. It hasn't changed much since then. It illustrates the size of the challenge we face as we come to grips with climate change. Every sector of the US economy depends on fossil fuels. In the US, the largest share of carbon emissions is generated by the transportation sector, followed by electricity generation, industry usage, commercial and residential usage, and then agriculture. Currently, we have a hodgepodge of regulations and standards that are working to lessen carbon emissions by sector, along with additional incentives to drive voluntary action on climate, like getting a rebate if you buy a heat pump furnace. These things are slowly driving down carbon usage, but we'd really like to move faster. And that's where carbon pricing comes in. So what exactly is carbon pricing? It's a simple idea that leverages the economic law of demand, a law that simply says if the price of something goes up, then the quantity demanded goes down. And we've all seen this in action. For example, when the price of gasoline goes way up, you start to hear stories in the media about how Americans are planning not to take road trips in the summer. It's natural behavior to avoid high prices. So carbon pricing refers to raising the price of carbon to drive a decrease in demand. The government would raise the price of carbon by charging a fee on each ton of carbon that's sold into the economy. And when the price of carbon goes up, then the price of products that include carbon or were produced using carbon, products like gasoline, natural gas, steel, cement, building materials, etc., those prices will go up too. And those price increases will drive both businesses and consumers to try to use less carbon. They'll do whatever they can, like switching fuels or adopting new technologies to avoid paying the higher prices. This is what people mean when they say that carbon pricing leverages the power of the market to decrease carbon emissions. And it starts a chain of events. Everyone wants to avoid high prices, so they want to buy non-carbon products. That stimulates innovation to develop and bring to market new non-carbon alternatives. And that creates new industries, and the new industries generate new jobs, and carbon emissions go down. And the coolest thing about this is it happens automatically across all sectors because we're raising the price of carbon itself. And there's a lot of evidence that this would really work to decrease carbon emissions. This graph was created in 2019, and it's based on an independent study by Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. It shows the expected amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the US from 2015 to 2030. This top line, the light blue line, shows expected decrease in greenhouse gas emissions if we stick with current policies. You can see that greenhouse gas emissions go down for a bit, but then they kind of level out. The dark blue line shows estimated emissions if a carbon fee was implemented in 2019 at $15 a ton, and then that fee was increased by $10 a ton every year going forward. You can see that the greenhouse gas emissions decline much more steeply, and they stay on a downward trend. And there's also an international impact to carbon pricing. Many countries have already implemented or are considering some form of carbon pricing, and some of those countries will charge carbon tariffs at their border on imported products that were not subject to carbon pricing when they were produced. Like, let's say I'm a country that has implemented carbon pricing, and the price of steel manufactured in my country has gone up 10%. If a country that hasn't implemented carbon pricing exports steel to me, I'm going to have to charge them a tariff at my border, so the price of their steel is on a level playing field with the price of my steel. Otherwise, their prices would undercut my manufacturers. So if the US implements our own carbon pricing, our exported product prices would already be adjusted for carbon usage and wouldn't be subject to tariffs. It's one more good impact of carbon pricing. But there is a but here. There is a downside. I kind of skipped over this before, but the downside is that prices will go up. And since carbon is interwoven into so many aspects of our economy, prices of many necessary goods and services will rise. And this will cause hardship for people who don't have extra money to spend, but they still have to get to work and they still have to heat their homes. This is where the dividend comes in. There is a way we can help offset higher fossil fuel prices. Carbon pricing will generate a lot of revenue. If we collected a $15 per ton fee on carbon for a year, it would generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $62 billion. And if the carbon fee went up $10 per ton every year after that, soon the annual revenue collected would be hundreds of billions of dollars. But what if the government collected all that revenue and then, instead of spending it, divided it up and sent out an equal share to all Americans as a carbon dividend? If we did that, then monthly dividend checks would offset what households would have to pay in higher heating and fuel costs. Research has shown that since lower income households tend to use less fossil fuel than higher income households, most lower and middle income Americans would be unaffected financially or even come out ahead with the dividend. So we can mitigate the biggest drawback to carbon pricing if we turn the carbon fees we collect into carbon dividends for Americans. And you can see that that face that was sad because of high prices has turned into a happy face at the end. And that's it. That's my quick overview of carbon pricing.
Thank you so much, and that was great, very useful for me, and I hope for our audience as well. Next up, we have Dr. Daniel McFadden. He is the Nobel laureate economist and UC Berkeley Professor Emeritus. Professor McFadden is the 2000 Nobel laureate in economics for his work in econometric methods for studying behavioral patterns in individual decision-making. Seems rather relevant to today's topic. And he is going to introduce us to the economics of carbon pricing.
I just unmuted. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
I'm happy to be here. You're all familiar with sin taxes, taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, or use taxes like taxes on gas, where the gas is used to drive cars that cause the road damage that has to be repaired. And a carbon tax is an excise tax, just like the sin or use taxes. And there are a number of questions you can ask about any tax like this. And let me say as a preamble that taxes are not a favorite topic of conversation. They rank just above death. But it is important to think about not only whether you have a tax or not, but how you administer it, exactly how the funds are used and so forth, so that issues about whether these taxes are effective in reducing carbon dioxide emissions, whether they're economical to administer, whether they're equitable. These are all questions that need to be answered. And the good news is that most taxes, like the carbon tax or like cap and trade, which is another form of carbon taxation, is that they are flexible. They can be adjusted to handle most of the objections. And I think there's one comment that came from Bill Nordhaus, one of my fellow laureates who really has specialized in climate change, which is that what's essential here is to reduce the carbon emissions that are driving climate change. That's the number one priority. Everything else about the taxes, equity, fairness, efficiency, and all that, those need to be addressed, but they're definitely secondary. And we should not let minor differences about who the taxes are impinging the most and how they're run and all that interfere with the main objective, which is to control the emissions to begin with. Now, I have said that carbon tax is just like a sin tax, like a cigarette tax. There is one thing that's important about it, and that is it can be administered at various points in the chain at which carbons come from the ground and then go back into the atmosphere. In particular, it can be assessed upstream on hydrocarbons as they are mined or imported, or it could be assessed downstream on carbon dioxide emissions as they are admitted into the atmosphere. And where it's administered can make quite a difference in how the tax works and how expensive it is to operate. There are about 2,000 major producers of hydrocarbons in the U.S. Mines, oil companies, and gas companies, and so forth. There are hundreds of millions of users who do the combustion at the final stage. So that, and on one hand, you want to tax at the point in which something really matters, which is at the emission of carbon dioxide stage, but it may be much more expensive and less effective to tax there than it is to tax at the origin, at where the hydrocarbons begin to come into the economy. That's one point I wanted to make. A second point is that the impact of taxes depends generally on how they're administered and who pays initially, although initial payments almost always get offset through some kind of price adjustment so that everybody ends up paying. And of course, in the end, consumers bear the ultimate burden for taxation. They pay the prices for the products that they consume, and those contain all of the taxes eventually. Now, let me mention cap and trade as an alternative to a carbon tax. A carbon tax is like an excise tax. A cap and trade works this way. Firms that emit carbon dioxide are issued permits for a certain amount of emission, and then they can either use these permits or they can trade them away to others who need them. And the initial permits may be given to the firms, or they may be sold in an auction run by the government, in which the firms buy these. And the level of carbon dioxide emission is controlled by the cap, which can decrease over time. And then the trade encourages these things to go into the hands of the people that most need them, but any firm that needs them will recognize that the price they're paying is the price that they could get by innovating and reducing their carbon dioxide emissions. So cap and trade schemes are a quite direct way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, particularly at the combustion stage. Now, it's possible. One of the features of cap and trade is that because these permits are tradable, they're traded like stock exchange stocks. They're subject to all the variation that those kinds of markets have, and that firms often don't like to operate in markets like that because they have to engage in either take a lot of risk or they have to do a lot of hedging to avoid the risk. It's possible to manage markets like that, like a cap and trade market, in the same way that the Fed manages the money markets by using quantitative easing, for example. So you could have a cap and trade system with top and bottom prices maintained by some agency that works kind of like the Fed works for money. So those are two alternative ways to do carbon pricing. And my timer tells me I'm already out of time, so I'll be quick. But let me just say in a couple of minutes what one can say about these on effectiveness. Both of these schemes can be quite effective, but cap and trade is more directly effective. You know what it's going to do. With carbon pricing, you have a known price. You can adjust that price to meet emission targets, but you do have to do that over time. For efficiency, both can be run fairly efficiently. However, the number of people you have to monitor and collect money from matters, so that an upstream tax at the producer level is easier to run. On equity, there are a variety of ways to make carbon taxes equitable. They're not, if the money is just absorbed into the general government revenues, they're not particularly equitable because the poor pay a higher percentage of their income than do the rich. But by things like the dividend that was mentioned by the previous speaker, or other kinds of allowances or subsidies, you can make these things equitable, both for consumers, low-income consumers, or firms that are adversely impacted, and so forth. For predictability and risk, cap and trade is risky because prices are volatile. They can be mitigated to some extent by banking permits, and carbon taxes. The extent of mitigation is uncertain, and you have to maintain flexibility in the system. And finally, there are international ramifications of any of these tax systems. If they're not global, then you have a problem with firms and trading circumventing the taxes by going to places that don't have controls. And that defeats the global purpose of these taxes. So that border rules and pricing has to be a part of any tax system like this that you consider. But let me just say, and in the end, these are the details that can occupy economists for a while to get it right. The devil is in the details when you design taxes, but the overall picture should be, I want to make emphatically clear, these things do work. They are generally the most cost-effective way to control something like emissions. Much more effective, I would say, than the kind of rules, zero carbon footprint, outlawing gas appliances, all that. All those are effective in their small way, but they're also quite costly. A general carbon tax is a much more efficient way to bring down overall carbon dioxide emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I am definitely learning a lot here. So we're now going to hear from Danny Richter, who is the VP of Government Affairs at Citizens Climate Lobby. Danny came to work on climate by way of medicine, realizing the potential for a warming world to make lots of people sick. He figured the best thing he could do for the most people was to prevent the warming in the first place. And as CCL's first staffer in DC, he established their DC office, where he's been responsible for developing their overall legislative strategy, clarifying the details of their policy, and interacting with other groups in DC. So Danny will be giving us an update from Capitol Hill.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for spending your time with us, taking time to educate yourself on this topic, and I'm sure many others. So what I'll talk about tonight is, I'll start by talking about the current opportunity before Congress, which is has to do with budget reconciliation. I'll talk about the timeline that Congress has been working with. I'll talk about the role of carbon pricing within this legislative opportunity, and then I'll bring in the international angle, take a global view on what remains a global problem, and I'll arrive at some conclusions. So let's begin with the current opportunity. The storyline in DC these days is really focused on reconciliation. The full name here is budget reconciliation, and this is a technical opportunity that exists in Congress typically once per fiscal year, and it has been used periodically by both parties when they control both chambers of Congress and the presidency to pass their priorities. For example, Democrats used it to pass important parts of Obamacare in 2010, and Republicans used it to pass the Trump tax cuts in 2017. The reason why it's attractive is because it only requires 50 votes in the Senate. The trade-off for that lower vote threshold, as opposed to regular order legislation, which requires 60 votes to get past the filibuster. So the trade-off is the Byrd rule. And the Byrd rule limits the kinds of things you can pass through budget reconciliation. Because of this rule, things that you pass through reconciliation tend to be clunky and inelegant. It also tends to be very partisan, because if you have majorities in both chambers and you only need 50 votes in the Senate, why talk to the other party? So right now, Republicans are not too happy about Democrats taking this path. This is actually the second reconciliation package to be taken up this calendar year, because the last Congress didn't pass one in the last fiscal year. and that was the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package passed earlier this year. President Biden is trying to cram a lot into this second package. He wants it to be $3.5 trillion, and he wants climate to be one of the main things addressed. So now let's move on to the second point, timeline. We actually know a lot about what Democrats want to try to accomplish in this plan, but we only know about it in a very general way. This is because on August 9th, Senate Democratic leadership issued a memo outlining what priorities they had and which committees they expected to address those priorities. Though the House is likely to pass their first version of a reconciliation bill on Monday, along with the bipartisan infrastructure package that has already passed the Senate, it's really the Senate version that is going to matter for reconciliation. And why is that? That's because the Byrd rule only exists in the Senate, not the House. And this is the once-a-year opportunity to pass something with only 50 votes in the Senate. You can always pass something with a simple majority in the House. So the Senate version is really going to be the more important version here. On climate, that August 9th memo also came shortly thereafter with a plan, presumably with some modeling behind it, although the details of that were not released, by Majority Leader Schumer. And the emissions reductions, when he added up all the policies that were in there to address climate, only got to a 45% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. President Biden's target is 50%, so it falls a little short with what's in there already. Schumer's plan, the memo, the August 9th memo, did not include a carbon price. It leaned very heavily on what's being called a clean electricity payments program. And there are real concerns even now about a clean electricity payments program being reconcilable. I mentioned how the reconciliation process is clunky, and the Byrd rule strips out a lot of things that you can do. There are real concerns about a clean electricity payments program being reconcilable. And since that's the biggest chunk that is currently in the Schumer 45%, that's very concerning to climate advocates. This takes us to September 3rd, when there was a leak from the Finance Committee. That was a document showing what they were considering to raise revenue. The Finance Committee is the only committee that can actually raise revenue, and they are in fact considering a carbon price. And that's one of the things about a carbon price in the world that Democrats are working within. It both addresses climate change and it raises revenue. And no other policy does that. So it's compelling that it solves two of Democrats' most pressing political problems at once. And the details of the leaked document suggested a $15 carbon price, increasing over time. They had three options for where to place the price, but all options would be paired with payments to low-income households and a border carbon adjustment. Last week, Resources for the Future, it's a very respected think tank in DC, RFF, they looked at three policies together. They included a carbon price, they included the Clean Electricity Payments Program, and they included the Clean Energy for America Act. It's a collection of subsidies. They left out modeling of other important policies like a methane fee that Democrats are also considering. But the punchline there is, according to this very reputable group, you can get to Biden's 50% reductions below 2005 levels pledge with those three policies together. So teamwork makes the dream work. And now let's get to the international angle. Again, that global lens for a global problem. The fact is that the United States is increasingly isolated in international climate circles. 34 out of 36 developed economies already employ a carbon price. And both our largest trading partner, that's Canada, and the largest foreign market available to American businesses, the European Union, are considering CBAMs, that's carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And this is important. I'm going to read this IPCC quote. IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the scientists, and it was unusual in their 1.5 degree report, which came out in 2018, that they weighed in on policy. But here's the quote: explicit carbon pricing remains a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies, end quote. And so from this quote, thinking about the rest of the world, where they are, they're going to be looking at carbon pricing, listening to scientists, listening to economists, as a necessary condition for ambitious policies. And the corollary to this is that if the United States doesn't have a carbon price, and they are increasingly isolated in the developed world. And from that map that we saw at the beginning, even developing countries are also implementing carbon prices. We are fundamentally unserious if we are not pricing carbon. So some questions in the current political context: can Biden, or really any US president, be seen as serious on climate if the United States continues not to have a carbon price? And how essential is it for President Biden's re-election chances if he has that he have an international win on climate? Can he get an international win on climate if so much of the developed world and the developing world is pricing carbon and we do not? So to conclude, bring it all back together, reconciliation is the focus in today's Washington. Though a latecomer in terms of policies to the discussion, carbon pricing is still very much a part of the debate because it both raises revenue and reduces emissions, and by quite a bit. And this could be the piece that brings Schumer's estimates in line with Biden's commitments. This would also solve an international problem that will be a problem for any president, Democrat or Republican, due to the advent of these carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the likely job losses that you might anticipate should we continue to be the bad actor on climate on the global stage. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate it. So our final panelist before we get to questions, and just as a reminder, you can put your questions either in the Zoom live stream. We do have a handful of people watching us over there already, and in the YouTube live stream or in the Zoom chat. And we'll get to them after our final panelist. Our final panelist is Mike Mielke of Silicon Valley. I'm sorry, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Mike supports hundreds of innovation economy companies to engage the public and wield influence in addressing the pressing environmental challenges that face communities. He's held posts with the White House Council on Environmental Quality and the National Estuary Program. And Mike will be discussing today the business case for carbon fee and dividends.
Great, thank you, Laurel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name.
Laurel. That's okay.
Thank you for that. And apologies everyone for joining late. Busy day, lots going on, including carbon pricing. So thank you for having me. Thanks to Susan Miller-Davis for helping put this event together and for coordinating my involvement. Thanks, of course, to the League of Women Voters of Piedmont for hosting us. And thank you to the audience for your interest and participation. So yes, my name is Mike Mielke. I'm head of public policy for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, or SVLG. I oversee and coordinate engagement at the state and federal levels for our members across 9 different policy areas, including housing, transportation, education, and of course, energy and the environment. A little bit about SVLG. We were founded almost 45 years ago by Mr. David Packard of Hewlett-Packard. And the Silicon Valley Leadership Group is composed of about 400 members that collectively represent the innovation economy. So we encompass the leading universities across the region: Stanford, Berkeley, Santa Clara, San Jose State, etc., as well as venture capital to early stage tech startups to mature companies like a Cisco or an Apple. And we have a history of support for carbon pricing. And so we're relative newcomers. As Danny said, this is a relatively new policy to supporting a carbon fee and dividend, or carbon tax. It depends on your audience and how you want to talk about the issue. But our members have supported and advocated for putting a price on carbon pollution for over 15 years. And this goes back to our support here in California of the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, to our engagement on the vote 10 years later on AB 398 here in California to extend the cap and trade system that we have here in California, which is our own state carbon pricing mechanism, to our support at the federal level for Waxman-Markey, which ultimately failed in 2010, which was a attempt to put a cap and trade system economy-wide here in the US. And then later to our support in principle position for HR 763 a couple of years ago, which was a carbon tax and dividend proposal. And then we are currently public in our support for a carbon tax as part of the package of bills making its way through Congress now, which again, I joined late, but I did hear Danny talking to you quite a bit about that. So you have the background on that. I also, I wrote a piece back in April of this year, and I'm happy to put that in the chat if folks are interested, stating that there is no valid debate anymore on the science behind climate change, right? So humans are releasing vast quantities of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, temperatures are increasing, the weather's changing, often drastically. As a result, we're seeing larger wildfires, longer droughts, bigger storms, worse flooding, and some forced migration because of all that. So absent systemic changes, a growing number of businesses understand that all of this means that there are significant and often irreconcilable risks now that are present for their operations, their value chains, and that present themselves for the communities that they operate in. So the real debate is not about the danger we face, but about how fast we can act and what's the best course of action. And of course, the vast majority of economists agree that a carbon tax is the most effective and critical means to reduce climate pollution and transform the global economy. Such a policy obviously would put a steadily rising price on carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases. And it would play well with other policies. So a lot of folks don't know this. Our cap and trade system here in California gets a lot of pub, but frankly, it's all the other policies that are doing the heavy lifting right now. So that's a low carbon fuel standard. It's all the energy efficiency measures that we've put in place here in California. It's the renewables portfolio standard. We have a storage mandate now for clean energy. So it's all these other suite of policies that are doing the heavy lifting now. But what backstops all of that is our state cap and trade program. So as we've already evidenced here in California, a carbon pricing system works well with other policies, right? So you don't have to trade off one versus the other. And due to the timing and the urgency here, we need an all of the above approach, right? We really need to go at this issue with every tool that we have in the toolbox. But it also works well on its own too. So I also want to share with the folks in the audience today that we commissioned a study a couple of years ago that really helped to make the case for a well-designed carbon pricing regime, at least for the high-tech sector, because we looked at it along the high-tech value chain. And some of the conclusions were that in the beginning, over the first 5 years, it had a limited scope for a number of reasons. But over the initial phases of putting a carbon pricing regime in place, carbon fee and dividend, which is what we looked at, would have an insignificant to small cost impact to the range of companies that we were looking at. It was ranged on the order of 0.02% in terms of OpEx on many of the companies, with these costs easily passed on to consumers. Economy-wide carbon pricing actually yielded notable economic opportunities. Yes, that's right, opportunities to many of the actors who'd already taken, moved forward and had begun to wring carbon savings out of their operations and offer low carbon products and services. And then also we saw that a well-designed carbon tax would dwarf other initiatives that companies were undertaking, such as moving to 100% renewable energy to power their operations, et cetera, because of the far-reaching nature of a carbon tax, the fact that it is so all-encompassing. So, all that said, the devil is definitely in the details. The policy wonks love to get into the weeds as much as possible. And so we've put forward a number of principles that I'm happy to share very briefly now. I can put this also in the chat for folks, and I'll end on this so we can get quickly to questions and comments from the audience. But SLVG's adopted 7 principles, and they are as follows. We really want to make sure that we have any carbon pricing system be effective and efficient. So it should be economy-wide, and it should really be focused on helping to achieve the greenhouse gas reduction goals that the US, including the Biden administration and others, have put forward, including with the Paris Agreement. Obviously, you want to make sure that we're promoting business competitiveness. And so the issue of how we treat carbon pricing across borders is really important, and that we're incentivizing action across borders, and so that we have a means to do this and engage, nation to nation. We want to avoid redundancy in regulation, so we want to provide a price signal that's strong enough to reduce the need for redundant regulation whenever possible, especially command and control. We want to make sure that any policy put in place is flexible, that we can adjust it as we move forward, tweak it as appropriate to make sure that we're reaching our goals. Fairness and equitability is really important. We need to make sure that the transition to a clean energy economy is affordable, and that we have reliable sources of clean energy for workers, families, businesses, and communities. We want to make sure that we have a smooth transition. So again, to this point, that here in California, we have cap and trade. In the Northeast, we have RGGI. There are the already existing subnational carbon pricing regimes. So we want to make sure that any federal and international carbon pricing integrates effectively, and then eventually transition from these subnational regimes to something that's national and hopefully international, and that we want to make sure it's durable. And that's the hardest piece, right? And that is that we catalyze broad bipartisan legislative sponsorship and long-lasting public support. And I will say the one thing that's very interesting about the dividend piece is I think a lot of our conservative colleagues and friends are concerned that once you start getting money into people's pockets for something, they're very loath to give that up. And so if you have a carbon dividend, and not like what we have here currently on our electricity bills, because I don't know if folks realize that, but you have a carbon dividend on your electricity bill here in California, but it's kind of buried. But if you actually receive a check in the mail or a direct deposit to your bank account, that tends to build a lot of support and does help with the durability issue. So I'll end it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. So we're going to get into some questions from our viewers. And as a reminder, you can post them. If you're watching on YouTube, you can post them there. If you're watching on Zoom, you can post them in the chat. I wanted to start with one follow-up question, I think for Danny. You had talked about, I think it was you who talked about other countries who have already implemented carbon pricing. And I'm wondering if you have any information on how effective their carbon pricing has been in reducing emissions, and if you have a timeline of when they, approximately when they implemented the policies.
Yeah, I think they have been effective, but you also have to add on that considerations of how high they get. So we're the EU ETS, largest foreign market available to American companies. They've had that in place since, I believe, 2005. But for a very long time, the price was not really high enough to do much. And so I was invited to tour a few European countries in 2014 with a view towards green policies that were going on in the EU at that time. And the question they were asking is, why is anybody paying anything at all for these permits? They had a price, it was about €5, and that was the question they were asking. There was a glut of permits at that time. But this year, the EU ETS is reaching record highs. €60, I think, is the high we've seen this year already. It's projected to go above €100 by 2030. And with the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that I also mentioned, we have pretty clear proof that not only are they enforcing good behavior with a price that high within the EU, they're also enforcing good behavior outside of their borders. So you have Russia, of all places, reading out an emissions trading scheme bill in the Duma and accepting on the first reading, and because they felt they stood to lose $8 billion a year because of the EU ETS. China accelerated their existing carbon pricing scheme. They're having some of the same problems the EU did at their launch. The price is really too low right now, but since it took the EU well over a decade to get that price up to a point where it's having an impact, I don't blame the Chinese for that. And so I think that these carbon border adjustment mechanisms are really amping up the pressure on other countries. And I think that the high price that you're seeing in the EU in particular, I think that's also sending a very strong signal to the rest of the world. Again, not just changing behavior within the EU, but changing behavior outside of their borders with countries that I know we also worry a lot about here in the United States.
One follow-up question to that: if you are, if the United States is implementing a federal price, is it more beneficial for them to try to do something lower that may not be particularly effective? And then once there is a tax in place, it's easier then to raise it? Can you speak a little bit about the process there?
That's a lot of political gamesmanship, looking very far into the future and considering a lot more factors. This processor doesn't have the ability to really do that. There is a logic to that. There's definitely a logic to that. I can see that. There will be enormous pressure on countries who adopt a CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, to just declare equivalence, because it's really, really hard to calculate for each different country what is the true carbon cost borne by that good when it crosses a border. It's really hard to do. I mean, just think about our own country. You talk about the Pacific Northwest, which is a lot of energy from hydro, and what is a good, if you're getting a good from there, export to the EU versus a good that's basically the same, manufactured in a state that has a lot more coal in their portfolio. Do they get treated the same? I mean, that's just really scratching the surface of the considerations. So there's really going to be a lot of pressure to just declare equivalence. You add currency fluctuations on top of that, it gets really complicated. So I think that it would be possible to have a lower carbon price and get and avoid all the bureaucratic headaches of figuring out really perfectly what is equivalence, and just saying good enough. We'll see in the actual implementation. Nobody has one yet, so I could be totally wrong, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Thank you. So a lot of companies have different tax breaks, like research tax breaks, and how would a carbon tax relate to those tax breaks? Is it just piled on top? Does it, can those research tax breaks be used? I think I'm understanding this correctly. Can those research tax breaks be used to offset a carbon tax? Maybe Daniel could answer that one. It's more of an economics kind of question.
Okay, well, I'm trying to say that in general, tax receipts are fungible. So from the point of the government, if it's taking in revenue from a carbon tax, it can reduce taxes elsewhere or increase subsidies elsewhere, so that it's certainly within the power of the government, for example, to use carbon tax proceeds to fund R&D in climate change, mitigation of climate change in various ways.
And vice versa? Or
well, and vice versa, the government could certainly get it wrong and undo some of the effectiveness of the carbon tax. Governments have been known to make mistakes like that.
Okay, thank you. I am hoping that one of you can speak a little bit about how the carbon tax relates to shifts toward cleaner energy. So I think it would be useful to give an example. We're talking a lot about economic policy and legislative policy, and I think it would be useful to have an example of something more concrete with a specific company like Exxon. Like how would the carbon tax relate to specifically motivating them to be to shift toward cleaner energy?
Well, let me answer again, which is that, first of all, the carbon tax is going to make carbon using products more expensive. That was discussed by Anne early on. So in particular, it's going to make gas using cars and high gas consumption cars more expensive to operate. People are going to shift away from that. They're going to look for innovations which shift away from that. So a lot of those incentives operate on the consumer side. Now, from a standpoint of a company like Exxon, they're an energy company. They would like to have a broader base than just hydrocarbons. These kinds of taxes increase the incentives to them to move into renewables and to diversify their portfolio. I think a lot of the effects of a carbon tax would be indirect, not just that you immediately stop using carbon dioxide producing products, but you begin to shift towards a whole range of products that are less carbon intensive to begin with.
Okay, thank you. So here in California, we have a suite of solutions. I'm mostly going to read this question from Randy, such as renewable portfolio standard and energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and those are remedies that are being considered today. Are there new initiatives for housing, like tax breaks for net zero housing development?
Yeah, I'll take that since I focus a lot on state policy as part of what we do. I mean, I think a lot of this, you have to look at it, it's systemic, right? So it's not just, when you look at transportation sector, transportation and housing are inextricably interlinked, right? Because you don't change where you live that often, and your kids don't change where they go to school, hopefully that often. And so we have to think about our development and our development policy and transit-oriented development, housing density. So there's a lot of focus on that. The governor just signed a bill really hoping to increase the amount of density per plot, which faced a lot of resistance, but was something that was long overdue here in California. We have a problem with getting enough housing on the market. That's part of the reason it's so expensive to buy a house here in California. And with that expense, it means people have, especially exacerbated by the pandemic, right, is folks have moved away from where they work. And as we eventually, grudgingly perhaps, go back to more working together in person, safely, of course, at the office, we want to make sure that folks are not traveling from some far-flung destination, For example, many folks, if they can afford it, move to Tahoe, or they move to Nevada, or they move to other places. So there's a suite of things that the state is looking at and that the state is doing. California is definitely a leader on all these issues in terms of climate, and there will definitely be more to come.
Thank you. Another question for you, Michael, though I think Danny might want to chime in about this one also. How can we get other corporations and trade associations to advocate for the reconciliation bill and its climate provisions? Currently, the US Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable are lobbying against it. How do we get them to follow SBLG's leadership?
Yes, the eternal question that Danny and I and others wrestle with a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of conversations behind closed doors. It's a lot of relationship building. It's a lot of retail politics, I guess, in another way, right? In terms of identifying leaders who are on the issues, versed in the issues, and are willing to speak out about it and to go before their peers. I know long time in this space of policy advocacy and engagement and coalition building, a lot of it's peer-to-peer and making the case one business leader to another. But I will say, I mean, we are fortunate. I am fortunate to work with a lot of companies that are very much leaders and forward thinkers, and see these kinds of problems as challenges to be embraced because there's opportunity that lies on the other side. Where a lot of companies who make up the US Chamber or other even regional chambers around the Bay Area even see this as a huge threat, of course, because it is. And so that impacts how they engage, that impacts how they communicate within their trade associations, and they throw around, let's face it, lots of money and lots of other soft power in terms of trying to make sure that the status quo doesn't change too fast, or if it does change, that it changes based upon what's going to work in their own best self-interest.
Danny, do you have anything you want to add on the reconciliation bill side of that answer?
Sure. I mean, I thought Mike's answer was great. Said most of the things I would. The only additional thing I'll throw in there with respect to reconciliation is, what is going to be most important for this group of Democrats and the commitments that they've already made. And so I think it's really important that they are seen to meet Biden's pledge of getting to a 50% reduction below 2005 levels. I think that politics have positioned it so that if they fail on that, I think their reality is it will be very hard for them to win elections, for them to retain control of the House or the Senate. So I think that Democrats are feeling like they're in the same boat. I feel like that's a litmus test. They believe that's a litmus test that voters will hold them accountable to. So there's enormous pressure for them to get something done. And so the question, as this relates to the original question, is how do they value, businesses are important to politicians, of course, but how do they value those opinions from the chamber, for example, who also does support a carbon price, but they are currently opposing the reconciliation package? How do they value that versus how do they value the rest of their voters, and given that climate is such an important issue? So that would be the only thing I would add there.
Can I add something that's related to that, if I might? It's we need to hear from everyone, including the environmental NGOs, and unfortunately, a lot of our friends, and I do mean that, I work closely with a lot of environmental NGOs here in California, have a mistrust of these kinds of policies. They're very much more in favor of command and control, kinds of regulations, which are clunky at best, and certainly not as far-reaching. And there's been a lot of misunderstanding about cap and trade about a carbon tax. And so there's still some education that needs to happen, even within the environmental NGO community. Let's not put it all just on business. If we're talking about this particular policy, there's still an uphill battle that we faced in regards to the folks in the environmental NGO community. And that's why I'm very happy to participate in this kind of event, because I think this helps with regards to that.
I have one follow-up question about the reconciliation bill. And it comes from Randy's first question initially. You partially answered it, Danny, but I'm still wondering what your thought is on the states that are dependent on the oil and gas industry, and whether you think that we can still get to over 50% in order to pass a reconciliation bill, even with so many states that aren't like California.
Yeah, it's not a slam dunk for sure. The next few months are going to be, there's going to be a lot of reasons for concern for me and for the volunteers in my organization, for anybody who wants to see this and is following the reconciliation package. It's an uphill slog. But what I've observed about Democrats is that they're not putting forward anything that they don't feel like the vast majority of their caucus is open to. It doesn't need to be, we need more than the vast majority. We need literally every single Democrat in the Senate for this. And so maybe that, so we will see. It remains a possibility that reconciliation doesn't happen. That is a possibility that this effort fails. I do think that would be electorally very problematic for Democrats in the midterm election if they come away from this process without anything to show for it. So we will see. And I will also say that it's, as Mike was pointing out, it's not just the moderates. I think there is also a concern about progressives, about liberals, with some of the policy options, with some of the dollar amounts that are being thrown around. So there's a concern from both ends of the spectrum within the Democratic Party within this highly partisan reconciliation process.
Thank you. There's another international question. How should the US engage across borders, especially given our diminished standing worldwide? Well,
I'll take this. I mean, what I would like to see is that we engage honestly with what we can do. I think the president takes a lot of heat, a lot of credit, regardless of who the president is. And really, for us to truly engage honestly, we need some of that needs to be felt by Congress. So I think that I would like to see more transparency, more honesty about, the president. The president does need Congress. I think it's easier to focus on the president, and certainly they're engaged in the international stage. But I would like to see more honesty about what a president can or cannot accomplish. More bringing Congress and congressional actors into this, and certainly I'd like to see leadership. I'd like to see ambition, but only if we can back it up. I'm tired of promises that we can't back up. That's my personal opinion.
So Daniel, you talked about initially carbon pricing being like a sin tax. And I'm wondering if you can give an example of, or discuss a little bit how that relates, how carbon pricing might work similarly to cigarettes. And was it really the tax on cigarettes that made any shift, or is it more health messaging, or do you need those two things to work in tandem?
Oh, I think the cost of cigarettes is a major impact. Had a major impact on cigarette consumption, and of course the social environment where people criticized others who were smoking and didn't want them nearby certainly accelerated that snowball but it's the pricing which really drove people out of cigarettes. And I think there are a couple of lessons there for carbon. It's not that we want to drive people, particularly poor people, away from things they really need for existence. What we want to do is give them the incentive to look for carbon-less ways to accomplish what they need. So that suggests that this tax should be combined with the dividend, or with effectively a lump sum payment back to people in some form. It could be indirect. It could be indirect through supporting education or childcare or the other social things that many people think would be useful for this country to have. But that's going to be a very important part of it.
And that leads to a follow-up question then. If, with cigarettes, it is a luxury. You don't need to be smoking cigarettes. With carbon emissions, I mean, we're not purchasing carbon emissions, right? We're driving cars, for example. And if there are no feasible alternatives, where does the carbon tax push people, right? What are the alternatives? Like if I'm priced out of buying a car that has carbon emissions, for example.
Well, if a carbon tax caused the price of gasoline to go up 40 cents a gallon, and you're a poor person, and you have to drive to work, you may still drive to work, but you certainly are not going to be much more open to the possibility of carpooling, or getting a small car, or perhaps getting an electric car. So all of these things are going to now be something for you to consider. And if you're getting a dividend, you may actually have as much money as you did before. You're not necessarily poor per se because of the carbon tax if the allowances or the exceptions or the dividend effectively offsets it. The incentive for you to get out of high carbon consuming goods is still there, and this tax will open these opportunities for businesses and innovators will see the advantage of going low carbon.
So,
well, can I
yeah, go ahead.
Crack at that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a light bulb moment for me was when I looked around and asked myself the question, how many of these things that I own did a business not own first? And I can't think of a single thing that I own that a business didn't own first. And the reason this was a light bulb moment for me was because I realized businesses are also buying a lot of goods, and for the things that I never see that are inside my computer, or I have no opinions on the tag at the back of my shirt that lists what size it is. Businesses are making decisions, and if they are buying from other businesses that decarbonize, that they're going to get savings. And so and just thinking about all the businesses that were involved in producing all the components in my computer through which I'm talking to you right now, there's so many decisions, there's so many businesses involved. And since I'm never going to see those or really have any informed opinion on what's in there, they're going to make these decisions based purely on cost. And the thing that has always appealed to me about a carbon price is that it really is systemic. I mean, it's those things that I never see, but businesses do. Those businesses that don't decarbonize, they're going to go out of business. And so if you're talking about consumers and the options that they have, to me, that's the other side of innovation. Those things that I don't see, but businesses see and go out of business if they don't adapt, that's where the innovation happens. It's not, the stories that we hear in the public, but it's, so I mean, that to me is what I find really compelling about this. And that's what I think will be unlocked with the carbon price, is those things that I don't see and never think about.
That's really helpful. So our audience loves a call to action. We often, we're people who are very engaged, and we want to know, what can we do? Like, we see this problem, we hear you talking about it. what can we do? So I wanted to close out today with sharing a few resources for you about some things that you can do. And let me just share my screen really quick. So if you want to learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby and become involved with them, you can either join or subscribe at cclusa.org. They're national, but they have local chapters similar to the League. You can also email President Biden about carbon pricing to help him put pressure at citizensclimatelobby.org/white-house. And if you have any questions, you can contact Susan Miller Davis, who is a Piedmont resident, and she is the co-leader of the Grasstops engagement for CCL in Alameda County. And I want to give a huge thank you to Susan Miller Davis, because she's also a League member. I don't think I said that yet. She's a member of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and she planned and organized this event, and she did a fabulous job of it. These panelists were all excellent. I feel like, as with many of our events, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more to learn. So I hope that you will take advantage of those resources. And I think Susan is going to put links, maybe you did already, in the chat so that you can directly click on those resources. They are there. So if you're on the Zoom call with us, go to the chat. You can open up those websites and take action right now, which is a good way to be involved. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again to our panelists and to Mayor King for giving us our introduction. And please feel free, if you're watching on YouTube, share the link with your friends and family who maybe were unable to attend today, and consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, and visit us at lwvpiedmont.org. You can either become a member or join our mailing list and help us in our efforts to educate voters on important issues like climate change. So this officially ends our program. Thank you so much for joining us.